The Kepler 442 Xenobiology Institute prided itself on being the most progressive academic establishment in 3 spiral arms. Their brochures, available in 47 languages and 12 electromagnetic spectrums, boasted of revolutionary cross-species collaboration and breakthrough interspecies understanding. What they failed to mention was that most of their faculty still refer to humans as the bipedal curiosities from a radiation-soaked mudball. Professor Gexvorn clicked his mandibles in what passed for scholarly enthusiasm as he gestured toward the holographic display of evolutionary trees. The assembled students, a carefully curated mixture of the galaxy's most promising young minds, sat in their species-appropriate learning pods, absorbing knowledge with a dedication that only comes from paying tuition rates that could fund small wars. As we can observe, Gexvorn chittered, his 4 eyes independently tracking different data streams. The so-called deaf world species demonstrate fascinating but ultimately primitive adaptations to their hostile environments. Note the excessive bone density, redundant organ systems, and hyperactive immune responses. The human exchange student, listed in the roster simply as Research Subject 7, sat in the back corner pod, her fingers moving across a data pad with mechanical precision. She hadn't looked up from her notes in the past 47 minutes, a fact that hadn't escaped the attention of 3 particular graduate students who had been studying her more intently than the lecture material. Observe the muscle fiber density, Gexvorn continued, manipulating the hologram to highlight human musculature, developed for a gravity well nearly twice galactic standard. Yet the species appears to have no conscious awareness of this advantage when removed from their hostile environment. Kexthalder, a Vorthack whose crystalline form refracted the lecture hall's ambient light into dancing rainbows, pulsed with what his species considered intellectual excitement. His thoughts resonated through his crystal matrix in frequencies that only other Vorthacks could perceive, but his vocalized comment was meant for broader consumption. Professor, is it curious how the specimen, excuse me, the student, demonstrates such docility despite these apparent physical advantages? His voice carried a particular tone of academic inquiry that barely masked personal fascination. Our preliminary observations suggest a remarkable disconnect between evolutionary capability and behavioral expression. The Moralian student, Zevvar, shifted her gaseous form within her containment suit. Her species communicated primarily through chemical releases, but the translation matrix rendered her contributions into standard galactic. Perhaps the evolutionary pressures that created these adaptations also selected for social compliance, a survival trait in a species that evolved in groups. Nil Vertex, the cybernetic Nexury representative, processed this exchange through 17 different analytical frameworks simultaneously. Her augmented consciousness found the entire discussion deliciously ironic, though she kept this observation to herself. Instead, she voiced what her social prediction algorithm suggested would advance the conversation in the most interesting direction. Has anyone actually tested these theoretical capabilities? She inquired, her mechanical voice carrying just enough innocent curiosity to sound academic rather than predatory. I mean, we have extensive theoretical models, but empirical data seems limited. Research Subject 7 finally glanced up from her datapad. Her expression registered the comment with the same detached interest one might show a mildly amusing statistical anomaly. She made a notation on her pad and returned to her work without comment. The human appears remarkably focused, Kexthalder observed, his crystalline form shifting to cast light patterns that indicated heightened interest. Professor, what can you tell us about their concentration capabilities? Gexvorn's mandibles clicked approvingly. Excellent question. Deaf world species often demonstrate extended focus periods as an adaptation to environmental threats requiring sustained attention. However, this can also indicate cognitive limitations, an inability to process multiple information streams simultaneously. So they're essentially running on single-threaded consciousness? Nil Vertex asked, her optical sensors whirring as they focus on the human. That seems inefficient. Inefficient, perhaps, Zevar mused, but potentially more manageable? Research subject 7's stylus paused for precisely zero point 0.3 seconds before resuming its movement. The pause was brief enough that most observers would have dismissed it as a natural rhythm in her note-taking. The 3 graduate students, however, had been watching long enough to recognize it as the first deviation from her established pattern. The literature suggests, Kextalder continued, his academic tone growing more confident, that Death World species often exhibit heightened defensive responses when directly approached or examined. But our subject seems remarkably accommodating. Subject. Research Subject 7 spoke for the first time in the session, her voice carrying no particular emotion. That's an interesting classification choice. The comment hung in the air like a gravitational anomaly, warping the comfortable academic discussion around it. Professor Gexvorn's lecture faltered momentarily as the 3 graduate students exchanged glances through their respective sensory modalities. A slip of terminology, Kextalder clarified quickly. We meant, fellow student, naturally. Naturally, she agreed, returning to her notes. Though I imagine the distinction becomes rather academic when the methodology remains the same. Nil Vertex's processors hummed with increased activity. The human's response patterns were deviating from predicted models in subtle but measurable ways. Most intriguingly, her physiological readings, heart rate, skin conductivity, microexpressions, showed no correlation with her verbal responses. It was as if her body and her words were operating on completely different protocols. Perhaps, Zevar suggested, her gaseous form swirling would barely contain excitement. We could conduct a more hands-on study session. For academic purposes, naturally, the professor did emphasize the importance of empirical observation. Research Subject 7 set down her stylus and folded her hands. For the first time since entering the lecture hall, she gave the 3 graduate students her complete attention. Her expression remained pleasantly neutral, but something in the quality of her focus made the ambient temperature in their section of the hall seem to drop several degrees. That, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, sounds educational. The private research alcove hummed with the kind of sterile efficiency that made academic misconduct feel scholarly. Nil Vertex had requisitioned the space through channels that weren't technically legal, merely creative interpretations of departmental resource allocation protocols. The walls displayed real-time biometric data from sensors embedded in the furniture, creating a light show of vital signs that would have impressed any medical facility in the sector. Standard cognition assessment first, Kextalder announced, producing a device that resembled a crystalline spider with too many legs. We'll establish baseline neural activity patterns before proceeding to physical evaluations. Research Subject 7 examined the neural scanner with the detached interest of someone reviewing a restaurant menu. Vorthack design, 3rd generation, originally developed for mining operations before medical adaptation. The neural mapping resolution should be adequate for your purposes, though the invasiveness parameters might exceed university guidelines. Zevvar's containment suit registered surprise through a cascade of yellow chemical indicators. You're familiar with xenotechnology specifications? I read the equipment manuals while you were setting up, the human replied, settling into the examination chair with the relaxed posture of someone attending a routine appointment. Your procurement records are surprisingly accessible through the student network. Administrative oversight appears to be a galaxy-wide constant. Nil Vertex processes information through her threat assessment matrices. The human had conducted intelligence gathering during the transition from lecture hall to research alcove, a span of exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds. More concerning was the implication that she had anticipated this scenario sufficiently to prepare. Impressive multitasking, Nil Vertex observed, extending several mechanical appendages to attach monitoring sensors. Though I notice your stress indicators remain remarkably stable. Most subjects experience elevated responses during unfamiliar procedures. Most subjects probably don't volunteer for this kind of research, came the reply, accompanied by an arm extended for sensor placement. Tell me, what's your hypothesis? That humans are more resilient than theoretical models suggest, or less intelligent than academic pride requires? The three researchers exchanged what passed for meaningful looks across their respective sensory spectrums. The humans' behavioral patterns contradicted every predictive model they had constructed: compliance without submission, cooperation without fear, intelligence without apparent cunning. Kexthalder initiated the neural scan, his crystalline form resonating with harmonics that would have been beautiful if they weren't designed to penetrate cranial bone. Fascinating. Your neural architecture shows standard mammalian organization, but the activity patterns are unusual. There's significant processing occurring in regions we associate with combat calculations, yet your external demeanor suggests complete relaxation. Combat calculations, she repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting interpretation. What is your equipment register when I consider mathematical proofs, or recipe modifications, or optimal traffic routing algorithms? The neural display shifted, showing identical activity patterns across entirely different cognitive tasks. Kexthalder's harmonic resonance faltered as his equipment registered readings that violated several fundamental assumptions about consciousness organization. You process abstract mathematics using the same neural pathways as threat assessment, Zevvar observed, her chemical releases now cycling through spectrums that indicated professional bewilderment. That's unprecedented. Only if you assume those are different types of problems, the human said. Pattern recognition, resource optimization, outcome prediction. The underlying algorithms remain consistent regardless of application domain. Nil Vertex's processors dedicated additional cycles to reassessing the situation. The human was demonstrating cognitive architecture that suggested radically different evolutionary priorities than any other known species. More disturbing was a growing realization that their subject was actively educating them about her own capabilities. Physical assessment protocols, Kexthalder announced, producing instruments that look more appropriate for materials testing than biological research. We need to calibrate theoretical muscle density against actual performance metrics. Naturally, the human agreed, though her tone carried subtle harmonics that Nil Vertex's audio processing flagged as potentially significant. Standard grip strength, reaction timing, pain threshold evaluation. I assume you've calculated appropriate safety margins for your equipment. The question contained implications that sent Zevvar's chemical systems into protective mode. The human was asking whether their instruments could survive the testing procedure, not whether she could. Our equipment is rated for handling samples with twice standard gravity adaptations, Kexthalder replied, his crystalline confidence wavering slightly. Unless theoretical models significantly underestimate. Theoretical models, she interrupted gently, tend to assume linear scaling relationships. Reality prefers exponential distributions, particularly in evolutionary pressure scenarios. But please, proceed with your evaluation. I'm curious about your methodology. The grip string assessment began with standard parameters, escalating through ranges that should have induced muscular strain in any reasonable organism. The human's readings climbed steadily past theoretical maximums, while her expression remained one of polite academic interest. Intriguing, she commented, watching the display spike beyond instrument ranges. Your calibration assumptions appear to be optimized for average rather than outlier performance, a common statistical oversight in xenobiology research. Are you recording this data for publication purposes? Nil Vertex's threat assessment algorithms were now operating at maximum capacity, generating warnings that she was systematically ignoring in favor of scientific curiosity. The human was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded their safety protocols while maintaining the conversational tone of a helpful librarian. Perhaps we should proceed to reflex testing, Zevvar suggested, though her chemical releases now carried distinctly nervous undertones. Standard stimulus response measurements. Excellent choice, the human replied, settling back into the examination chair, though you might want to adjust your recording parameters. Deaf world reflexes tend to operate outside standard biological response curves. She paused, considering something that made her smile with genuine amusement. Actually, before we continue, have any of you read the literature on predator recognition behaviors? It's quite relevant to interspecies research protocols. The question lingered in the sterile air like a chemical weapon disguised as academic inquiry. None of the three researchers answered immediately, which the human appeared to find mildly disappointing but unsurprising. The silence suggests no, she continued, adjusting her position in the examination chair with fluid economy of movement. Understandable oversight. Most civilized species evolved past the need for such primitive survival mechanisms. Prey recognition becomes irrelevant when you've eliminated natural predators from your environment. Kexthalder's crystalline matrix pulsed with irritation at the implied classification. We're hardly prey animals. Vorthack civilization achieved interstellar capability while your species was still discovering fire. Technological advancement and evolutionary hardwiring operate on different timescales, she replied with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students. Your civilization is impressive. Your individual survival instincts are quaint. The reflex testing apparatus arrived via automated delivery, wheeled into position by a service drone that departed with mechanical indifference. The device bristled with stimulus generators designed to provoke involuntary responses, light flashes, sonic pulses, pressure variations, electromagnetic fields. Standard neurological assessment tools that have been refined across thousands of species over centuries of research. Remarkable engineering, the human observed, examining the setup with professional appreciation. Though I noticed the maximum stimulus settings are calibrated for pain avoidance rather than pain tolerance. Another statistical assumption that might prove limiting. Zevvar's gaseous form churned with uncomfortable chemicals as she processed the implications. Pain tolerance isn't typically relevant to reflex assessment. We're measuring involuntary neural responses, not conscious endurance. Assuming those represent separate systems, came the mild correction. Deaf world evolution tends to blur such distinctions. When environmental threats operate beyond normal biological ranges, survival often requires conscious override of involuntary protective mechanisms. Nil Vertex's mechanical components whirred as she recalibrated her analysis parameters. The human statement suggested neurological integration patterns that violated fundamental assumptions about consciousness organization. More troubling was her continued willingness to educate them about her own vulnerabilities, or what appeared to be vulnerabilities. Initial stimulus sequence, Kexthalder announced, activating the first series of tests. Light patterns designed to trigger defensive blink responses cascaded across the human's visual field in increasingly aggressive configurations. She watched them with the relaxed attention of someone enjoying a particularly artistic fireworks display. Her blink rate remained unchanged from baseline measurements, even when the luminosity reached levels that should have triggered automatic protective responses. Curious, Nil Vertex muttered, her vocal processors betraying mechanical uncertainty. Either your protective reflexes are severely compromised, or they're being consciously suppressed. Third option, the human suggested helpfully. The stimulus parameters fall within normal operational ranges for my visual system. Solar radiation on my homeworld operates at significantly higher intensities. Your maximum settings approximate what we consider comfortable indoor lighting. The sonic testing produced similar results. Frequencies that should have induced involuntary startle responses earned only mild interest, as if the human were listening to background music rather than experiencing neurological assault. Fascinating adaptation, Zevvar observed, though her chemical releases now carried distinctly worried undertones. Your sensory systems appear to be calibrated for environmental extremes that would prove lethal to most known species. Most, the human agreed, though I suspect your homeworlds had their own unique challenges. Different evolutionary pressures produced different solutions. Your species developed remarkable intelligence and social cooperation. Mine developed different specializations. Kexthalder's confidence was rebuilding as the testing proceeded. The human's responses, while unexpected, remained within manageable parameters. Her compliance continued absolute, her demeanor unchanged, her cooperation unwavering. Perhaps the initial anomalous readings had been instrument errors rather than genuine cause for concern. Physical stimulus assessment, he announced, producing devices that looked distinctly less academic than their predecessors. Direct neural stimulation through controlled discomfort, standard methodology for mapping pain pathway organization. The human's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The change was subtle enough that Kexthalder missed it entirely, though both Nil Vertex and Zevvar registered the alteration through their respective sensor modalities. Something in the quality of her attention had changed, not increased exactly, but focused in a way that made the ambient air feel heavier. Pain pathway mapping, she repeated slowly, as if testing the phrase for linguistic accuracy. That's an interesting euphemism for torture, though I suppose academic terminology makes everything sound more civilized. Not torture, Kexthalder protested, his harmonic resonance taking on defensive frequencies. Controlled scientific observation of physiological responses to graduated stimuli, completely standard procedure for understanding species-specific neurological organization. Of course, she agreed readily. Scientific methodology justifies considerable flexibility in ethical boundaries. I'm familiar with the concept. My own species has extensive historical experience with research conducted on unwilling subjects in the name of advancing knowledge. The comment carried implications that sent warning cascades through Nil Vertex's threat assessment protocols. The human was drawing parallels between their current activity and historical atrocities, yet her tone remained conversational, almost friendly. However, she continued, settling more comfortably in the examination chair, I should mention one small detail before you proceed with direct neural stimulation. She paused, considering her words with the careful precision of someone selecting exactly the right ammunition for a particular target. The literature on human military history is quite extensive and readily available through your academic databases, particularly the sections dealing with interrogation resistance training and the psychological profiles of individuals selected for deep cover operations. You might find it educational reading. Kexthalder's crystalline form went completely still as the implications registered through his consciousness, like spreading fractures through perfect crystal. What exactly, he asked slowly, is your academic specialty? Applied xenopsychology with focus on threat assessment and species interaction protocols, she replied, her voice carrying the same pleasant tone one might use to discuss weekend plans. My dissertation examines the correlation between technological advancement and the atrophy of survival instincts in post-scarcity civilizations. The silence that followed this revelation had weight and texture, like atmosphere before a storm. Kexthalder's crystalline form began displaying stress fractures that sparkled in the laboratory lighting. Zevvar's containment suit registered chemical releases that are species associated with imminent predation events. Nil Vertex's processors allocated emergency resources to combat scenarios while maintaining external calm through sheer mechanical discipline. You've been studying us, Nil Vertex stated, her vocal modulator struggling to maintain academic neutrality. This entire session has been reverse research. Observational methodology. The human corrected gently. Though I admit the data collection has exceeded my initial projections, your behavior patterns demonstrate remarkable consistency with theoretical models regarding civilized species' inability to recognize predatory behavior when presented in cooperative contexts. She shifted position in the examination chair, the movement somehow transforming the furniture from restraint into throne. The change was purely postural, yet altered the entire dynamic of the room in ways that bypassed conscious analysis and spoke directly to evolutionary programming. For instance, she continued, you spent the last hour conducting increasingly invasive procedures on a member of a species you acknowledge possesses superior physical capabilities, enhanced pain tolerance, and documented military history involving resistance to interrogation. Yet none of you questioned why I was quite so cooperative. Kexthalder's harmonics shifted into frequencies that his species reserved for territorial warnings. You're threatening us. I'm educating you, she replied with gentle correction. Though I understand the distinction might feel academic from your current perspective. The neural stimulation device hummed to life in Kexthalder's grasp, its activation involuntary, the stress response masked as aggressive action. The pain induction field swept across the space, designed to deliver precise neurological discomfort calibrated for maximum effect without permanent damage. The human absorbed the stimulation with the mild annoyance of someone experiencing a brief interruption in their lecture. Her physiological readings registered the neurological assault, acknowledged its presence, and continued operating within normal parameters as if pain were merely another form of background noise. Interesting choice, she observed, apparently unaffected by sensations that should have incapacitated any reasonable nervous system, though you might want to reconsider the escalation trajectory. My research indicates that cornering predators rarely produces favorable outcomes for the cornering party. Kexthalder increased the stimulation intensity, his crystalline matrix now blazing with harmonic frequencies that bordered on ultrasonic shrieking. The device registered output levels approaching its maximum operational capacity. Enough data? She inquired politely. Then she moved. The motion was economical, precise, and utterly casual. One moment she was seated in the examination chair, apparently restrained by monitoring equipment and stimulation fields. The next moment, Kexthalder's primary crystalline support structure was separated from his resonance chamber with a sound like expensive glassware experiencing sudden contact with concrete flooring. She had never appeared to stand up. The remains of what had been a graduate student in xenobiology scattered across the laboratory floor in fragments that would require significant effort to reassemble. The neural stimulation device continued humming, now directing its output at empty air where its target had been moments before. Cervical displacement, she announced conversationally, settling back into her chair and retrieving her data pad from where she had placed it during the examination setup. Standard technique for rapid incapacitation of silicon-based life forms. The crystalline matrix makes structural failure points quite obvious once you understand the resonance mechanics. Zevvar's gaseous form was attempting to compress itself into the smallest possible volume within her containment suit, a biological impossibility that she was nevertheless achieving through sheer terror-induced molecular cohesion. You killed him, Nil Vertex stated, her mechanical voice processing the information with digital clarity even as her threat assessment protocols screamed warnings that were now entirely too late to be useful. I provided a practical demonstration of the theoretical concepts we were discussing. The human corrected, making notations on her data pad with the same methodical precision she had maintained throughout the session. Academic research benefits from empirical validation of hypothetical models. She glanced up from her notes with the expression of someone who had just remembered an important detail. Oh, And for your future reference, humans don't actually snap necks. That's a theatrical convention. What I did was disrupt his primary structural matrix through applied harmonic resonance, which is considerably more efficient for crystalline life forms. Species-specific methodology is quite important in practical applications. The laboratory's automated systems, designed to monitor students' safety and academic compliance, registered the sudden absence of one set of vital signs and began initiating emergency protocols. Alerts cascaded through administrative networks, summoning medical assistants and security personnel to investigate what the systems classified as an unexpected cessation of biological function during routine academic activity. I believe this concludes our research session, the human said, gathering her materials with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose schedule is proceeding exactly as planned. Thank you for your participation in my dissertation research. The data on post-scarcity civilization threat recognition deficits should prove quite valuable to the academic community. She paused at the laboratory door, considering something that apparently amused her. You know, the really fascinating aspect of this whole interaction isn't that you failed to recognize the predator in your midst. It's that even now, with empirical evidence of your miscalculations scattered across the floor, you're still processing this as an academic exercise rather than a survival scenario. The door sealed behind her with the soft whisper of pressurized atmosphere, leaving two survivors alone with the educational materials that had once been their colleague and the growing realization that their understanding of the universe had been significantly more limited than their university brochures had suggested.